Okay, well, welcome everybody
Hey,
to
guys.
our third session of Deep Dive into Shabbat. For those who have not been following, just a brief summary, just so we can go over the arc of what we're trying to accomplish here. The overall goal, as we discussed last time, is really to spend these 5 sessions, maybe we'll make it 6 if people are interested, in really delving deep into the essence of Shabbat, both in terms of a general big picture Jewish traditional sense, and also in a very specific liberal Jewish context, with the understanding that the liberal Jewish community in America, in many ways, approaches Shabbat a little bit differently. Because if we're in a traditional Jewish community, Shabbat is synonymous with the hundreds and thousands of laws of Shabbat. And so it's very prescriptive in terms of exactly what to do for every single part of Shabbat, exactly what not to do for every part of Shabbat. And I actually think that the liberal Jewish community has an interesting and at times actually a more interesting and more unique challenge, because the liberal American Jewish community is in a position where largely sociologically, obviously this doesn't apply to everybody, but it's a generalized statement, the liberal Jewish community does not feel bound by halacha, right? So just because Jewish law says something or says not to do something doesn't mean that a community is specifically going to or not going to do something. In the words of Mordechai Kaplan, who was a great American rabbi, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, he has this famous quote that Jewish law should always have a vote, but not a veto, which I think is very much how a lot of the liberal Jewish world functions, where you always take into account what Jewish law, the Talmud, traditional Judaism says, but if for whatever reason there's a need to move beyond halacha, the liberal Jewish community has been willing and at sometimes quick to do so. But on the other hand, the liberal Jewish community clearly cares about and values Shabbat. And Shabbat is just as much a cornerstone of liberal Judaism as it is a cornerstone of Judaism writ large, as it's been for the last 3,000 years. So really that was the impetus for this class, and just going over what we've done the last 2 weeks for people who haven't been with us. The first week, we really talked about this idea of Shabbat being something metaphysical, which is just fancy philosophic gibberish for saying that Shabbat is our understanding, and it's at the root of Jewish philosophy, that there's more to the world than materialism. That Judaism as a tradition is a tradition that values interaction with the world, right? We do not value being ascetics. We do not value, foregoing all of our possessions, right? We actually do care about things and objects and realize that the world needs to have materials and money and people working in order to function. But we also realize that there's more to life than just those things. And that's why we have this fascinating differentiation where the Torah says 6 days you should work, right? So 6 days of the week, we do view work, physical work, right? Going out in the world and changing it to be of fundamental importance. But then on the 7th day, we also view it as crucial that we have a day where we realize that there's actually more to the world than just that work. And we actually set apart a day to try to self-actualize in a higher way, which then opens the door to, once we admit and once we acknowledge and once we lean into the fact that there's more to the world than just physicality, that opens the door for religious ideas and ideals. That opens the door to God. That opens the idea to spirituality. So that was all class 1. Last week, we had a fascinating discussion about what it actually means to rest on Shabbat. And the main question that we were talking about, and today, to some extent, the conversation will continue a little bit from that last week, but even if you weren't here last week, I think it'll still be fully comprehensible, is the fundamental question of, is work on Shabbat something subjective or objective? And we talked about this massive discussion in the Talmud, where one position says work is something that's objective and it's qualifiable, and here are actions that under no circumstances you can do. And then there's another position in the Talmud, that of Rabbi Shimon, for those who are remembered from last week. And Rabbi Shimon is much more of an intentional person, right? So for Rabbi Shimon, it might be, at least according to one understanding, there's no such thing as black and white categories of things we can do and can't do on Shabbat. It depends on the intentionality behind it. And as we concluded last week, I think that has far-reaching implications for a cultivation of a liberal Jewish practice, one that, again, is not necessarily going to be rooted in the hilchot of Shabbat, right, the laws of Shabbat, but one that I believe has to be rooted in intentionality about Shabbat. And so we ended off last week with reading an excerpt that said, trying to pave a new way forward in terms of liberal Jewish communal practice of Shabbat, one where, from some perspective, one could say, we're not going to tell people what to do and what not to do in terms of which actions are okay or not. What we are going to try to cultivate is do whatever actions you want, but be intentional about how you're doing every single thing you're doing on Shabbat to ensure that's actually furthering the goals of Shabbat. Because the fear is, if you don't have one of the two, right? If you don't have the actions and you don't have the intentions, then it's tough to see, one, what a Shabbat practice looks like, but also what the future of that Shabbat practice looks like. And so we can choose. We can either be Rabbi Yehuda people or Rabbi Shimon people, right? We can be bound by strict legal law, or we can be bound by intentionality. But it is important to make that choice, because a non-choice here is synonymous in some sense with saying that Shabbat is much less of a value. So that was all last couple of weeks. Today, I want to focus on another question that I think is of equal importance in Shabbat. And I will share my screen in a second. But the question that I wanted to focus on today is a question of, when it comes to Shabbat, are we trying to affect change on an individual level? Meaning, when it comes to Shabbat, are you responsible for yourself as an individual? Or are we actually trying to control the environment around us? And I think this debate will come clear as we go through some of the sources. But just to sort of iterate it one more time, do environmental factors, right? Is there a need, or is there a positive in placing yourself in a specific environment on Shabbat that feels more, for lack of a better word, Shabbistic, Shabbati, right? That feels more in the ethos of Shabbat? Or is Shabbat solely an individual practice where, to some extent, right, we can imagine like the laws of keeping kosher, right? With keeping kosher, there aren't necessarily certain environments that you care about kosher or not, right? It's all about when you take out your sandwich, is that sandwich kosher or not, right? Does that same thing apply to Shabbat? So that's sort of what I want to tease out. So I'm going to share the link to the sources for people who didn't get them earlier. And I'm going to share my screen, and we will hop right in to what I think will be an interesting conversation about Shabbat here. Okay. So just to sort of put everything in perspective here, we get what I think is a really funny, interesting, introspective piece of Talmud, which I think highlights the fact that Jewish tradition and the rabbis, and again, when I say rabbis, I'm talking about the rabbis of the Talmud, 2nd to 7th century, the rabbis were aware in their imagination of what Shabbat was, that they were heavily departing from the way that the Torah describes Shabbat. And the rabbis are very honest with themselves. And what they say is this great line where they say the laws of Shabbat are like mountains suspended by a hair, right? This is an amazing imagery, because what they're describing is there is a ton of laws and discussion about Shabbat, right? As big of a mountain. Suspended by a hair means, as Rashi describes, when it comes to the Torah's description of what we actually should be doing on Shabbat, there's nothing. There's maybe 20, 25 lines. The Torah is very vague about what rest is. The Torah is very vague about what it means that Shabbat is sanctified. And so to some extent, in the rabbis' admission that the laws of Shabbat they have a very rocky or loose foundation, right? If this was a philosophy class, we would say that the premise is very weak as to why we're doing things, or the epistemological background to Shabbat, at least rooted in the Torah, is a little shaky. But interestingly enough, this actually opens the door for a Jewish communal creation of Shabbat. Because unlike plenty of other things in Judaism, right? I'm going to compare it with the laws of kosher for a second again. When it comes to the laws of kosher, there isn't a lot of wiggle room there in terms of a community's cultivation of what that means, right? You can imagine a community that keeps kosher and a community that doesn't keep kosher. But to some extent, if the Torah says don't eat pork, right, it's very hard to come up with creative solutions to eat pork within Jewish tradition. When it comes to Shabbat, because the biblical or the Torah background is, again, like this imagery of a hare, that really does open up the community. And I think the importance of actually having these conversations, laying down the foundation for what it means to celebrate Shabbat. I want to do a brief show and tell, only because we're not in person. If we were in person, I would have this here. But I want to, just for people that have never been able to quantify just how much discussion there is about the laws of Shabbat in our tradition. So this is the Talmud Tractate Shabbat. This is what an average page of Talmud looks like. The middle is the actual text of the Talmud. On both sides is commentary, right? One commentary named Rashi, one named Tosfot. And this is how thick this book is. These are hundreds of pages. And this is only the Talmud of Shabbat. And one thing that I love to stress about Jewish tradition that I think is really telling, especially in the case of Shabbat, for every one page of Talmud, there are about 100 to 200 pages of medieval and subsequently modern sages debating about how to understand those pages of Talmud. So it's like this is, imagine if our Constitution in America was this long and you had Supreme Court cases debating the ins and outs of the Constitution. That's basically what Jewish learning has been for the last 1600 years, which is why there's sort of endless Jewish books and there's sort of always more endless Jewish scholarship to come. Okay. So we are going to, after that sort of lengthy introduction, there's a famous essay or monologue that Isaiah or Yeshayahu, probably one of the most famous prophets, delivers about Shabbat, which ends up being the foundation for a lot of the laws about Shabbat. Now, one thing that I want to say, and then I'll call on somebody to read here, is that for those who are familiar with the later chapters of Isaiah, specifically chapter 58, this is actually, I think, one of the most important chapters in the entirety of the Tanakh. This is Isaiah's prophecy or monologue where he spends his entire time critiquing the temple. And Isaiah's entire point is basically, there's a temple happening, right? This is in the time of the first temple, right? So 6th century BCE and before. And he's saying that Judaism has been overly obsessed with the rituals of this temple. This is bad, right? This isn't what God wants. God wants people to care about other people, right? And if people aren't doing that and they're overly obsessing with ritual, something's gone wrong. Now, what's interesting is that the way that Isaiah ends this monologue is he actually talks about Shabbat. And at first glance, this is puzzling. And a lot of Jewish scholars ask this question and they say, Isaiah is the ethics guy. Why is the ethics guy talking about a ritual, right? Shabbat is a ritual. And this then opens the door to classic and numerous commentaries suggesting that there's actually a very important societal, social, communal dimension to Shabbat, right? Next week, we're going to focus on the social ramifications of Shabbat. But in terms of the environmental ramifications for Shabbat, Isaiah opens the door for at least the first part of our conversation today. Elaine, can I ask you to read this first source here?
I had to unmute myself.
Perfect.
Want me to read Isaiah 58?
Yeah.
If you refrain from trampling the Shabbat, from pursuing your affairs on my holy day, if you call the Shabbat delight, the Lord's holy day honored, and if you honor it and go not your ways, nor look to your affairs, nor strike bargains, then you can seek the favor of the Lord. I don't like that. Okay. I will set you astride the heights of the earth and let you enjoy the heritage of your father Jacob, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken.
Perfect. Thank you, Elaine. So what Isaiah is doing here is a fascinating imagery, right? We can imagine this in the context of the critique of the temple. And for people that haven't had the opportunity to read the entire chapter of Isaiah 58, I would have brought it, but didn't want to have 3 full pages of a wall of text here. Isaiah really does levy a multifaceted critique of the entire ritualistic enterprise. Isaiah really was against the temple. He was against sacrifice. He was against the over-ritualization of Judaism. Yet he still feels like in the ritual of Shabbat, there's something of extreme ethical importance. Because I think he recognized, and this harkens back to what we were talking about 2 weeks ago, the recognition of a day that's not all about business, that's not all about the economy, a day where you don't look to your affairs, a day where you don't strike bargains.
They can see you.
That's a society, right? A society that values that, a society that makes room in their community for a day where we actually say we don't care at all about business ventures, about economy, about capital, about any of these things that makes the world go round for the other 6 days. That's a society that's going to be more attuned to the moral needs of those that are less fortunate. So the Talmud, of course, picks up on this theme, and the Talmud sort of lays out what I like to call extra legal Shabbat laws, because as we learned last week, Shabbat is centered around these 39 malachot, 39 categories of work that we're not supposed to do. The entire conversation today is extra legal. These are things that are not included in those 39 categories of Shabbat, but these are laws in which the Talmud was very concerned about when it came to the practice of Shabbat. And for our contemporary Shabbat, laws that I think are actually more important in a lot of ways than the original categories of work. Lila, can you read the Talmud Shabbat on Isaiah here?
Sure. And you honor it that your dress on Shabbat should not be like your dress during the week. The words going your own way mean that your walking on Shabbat should not be like you're walking during the week. From attending to your affairs, means it is prohibited to deal with your weekday affairs and to speak about them on Shabbat. However, affairs of heaven, those pertaining to mitzvot, are permitted. And speaking idle words means that your speech on Shabbat should not be like your speech during the week. One should not discuss their weekly affairs on Shabbat.
Awesome. So I'm going to unshare my screen for a moment just so we can have a little conversation about this for anybody that wants the sheet. The link is in the chat here. What is the environment that Isaiah and the Talmud's commentary Isaiah is attempting to cultivate here, right? Because again, this has nothing to do with forbidden laws on Shabbat, right? Forbidden laws on Shabbat, right? We all know you're not allowed to write up a business contract on Shabbat, right? We all know you're not supposed to go to the bank and take out a loan, right? We all know these things, right? We already learned these in the laws of Shabbat, right? The Torah and Talmud already taught these. So what dimension is Isaiah adding here to Shabbat? How would you summarize it?
You're not supposed to do the regular things you do all week, right? Basically.
Okay. So there should be some fundamental differentiation between everything you're doing during the week and everything you're doing on Shabbat, right? This should be a day that, from what you're saying, a day that should be so far from what your average day is that it's almost like you're living another life.
Another life, right?
Also, I think the idea of not dressing the way you dress the rest of the week, or not walking the way, now that the walking is sort of how would you walk differently from the rest of the week as on Shabbat, but dressing differently is much more of an image to feel to separate. Really, that's the difference between the Shabbat and the rest of the week, is a separation of trying to experience something that raises you above or separates you from Chol. Chol is secular, but I don't mean secular.
The weekday, like the days of the week are called Yemot HaChol.
Right.
So 100%. And I just want to say the metaphor of walking here, I think, is actually quite beautiful, because the word for walking in Hebrew is holech, right? And the word for Jewish law is halacha, right? And so what this is saying is all of your goings should just be fundamentally different. Henry, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, so I want to make a comment about what Elaine said about walking, and about we as Reform Jews, we walk the same. We walk on Shabbat the same way we walk during the week. So let me propose something. When I watch Orthodox Jews in in the United States or in Israel. During the week, they walk very fast. They're always in a hurry to go nowhere, it seems. But on Shabbat, they walk slowly. They seem to have a much different way of walking. And am I right about that?
No, you're 100% right. And this is actually reflective in, interestingly enough, there's another area of the Talmud where it's discussing what this means. And it says, during the week, you walk fast. On Shabbat, you shouldn't take large steps. So you're actually spot on. But I think this just encapsulates the complete mindset switch. Because again, going off what we were discussing last week, where intention is the key to Shabbat, right? It is what we're doing intentional. During the week, there's an ethos of you're constantly rushing, because Judaism as a tradition, and also America and the West as a tradition, both very much values work, right? You know, in America, we very much value the idea of capitalism. We very much value the idea of contributing to the economy, right? Always wanting to get ahead. There's always more you can do. In Judaism, we actually value very similar things, but, you know, on a slightly different front, but there's always more work in the world to do, right? We believe in, you know, fundamentally fixing the world, going out there. Shabbat is a day where you basically decide, okay, hard pause there. And so, yeah, you're 100% right. Marilyn.
Is there some intention that the values and ethics of Shabbat will spill over to the rest of the week? In which case it will become more and more difficult to notice, you know, to make a difference. That was one thought I had, and another thing, this is just a personal, honestly, your class is reminding me that I really feel guilty about Shabbat. I see the value of it, and I would like to find a way to honor it, but it's a huge, for me, it's a huge undertaking. It's so alien to the life I've been living. And I think I was hoping that our class would address that and see how we can make steps to reach those, to go in that direction, coming from where we are.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So let me touch on your second question before the first, because I think that's a little bit more fundamental. The view of Shabbat, where it all revolves around intentionality, I think also necessarily becomes a view of Shabbat, and also a view of Judaism in general, by the way, which there's no such thing as binaries in black and white. So that, you know, we oftentimes, and there's one stream of Jewish thought, one that I think the liberal Jewish community rejects, rightly so, which says that you're either in or out. And, you know, you either keep Shabbat or you don't keep Shabbat, right? These are very unhelpful categories, because the vast majority of the Jewish community is in some sort of middle position. So it doesn't make sense, according to some view, according to my view also, to have a superimposed legal structure on Shabbat to try to put it on people and say, okay, you're either in or out, because the reality is that's just not realistic. A view of Shabbat where intentionality is what we're truly reaching after, there's sort of infinitesimal steps on the way from nothing to everything, right? And so whichever way we chalk that up, right? And so in Judaism, I'll just connect this to I think another Talmudic debate, because I think that might be illustrative here. There's a debate in our tradition, and the Talmud has a very famous debate on whether or not Jewish learning is more important or Jewish action is more important. And it's a very interesting philosophic debate, especially in light of when this debate was taking place, which was in the 2nd and 3rd century, right after Christianity basically came and said, well, action is much less important than faith, right? Faith over works. right? So the rabbis, were not immune from the wider theological debates at the time. So the rabbis are also taking up this question. And the rabbis basically decide that learning and conversation is more important, but only because they viewed learning and conversation as a direct inspirational conduit to some sort of action. So I said 2 weeks ago, and I still do believe it, that there is an irony in what we're doing here, because Shabbat is about small nuances in how we live our lives one day a week. And so discussing it on a Wednesday night is a little ironic, but I think the whole point is not to make anybody feel bad, but to give the language to a liberal Jewish practice of Shabbat, of what it could mean to know sociologically and individually, the laws of Shabbat are not going to be taught and kept as these multiple hundred pages of Talmud, but cultivating a spirit of Shabbat where everything is in the spirit of some intentionality there. And so that's really what I think we're trying to do. In the last class, we can give some maybe actual pragmatic steps, but really, I think philosophically, I really wanted to lay the groundwork there, because I don't want people in the liberal Jewish community, and this is something that I also talk about a lot on campus, I don't want the view to be, I think it's a very unhealthy view where, where Reform Judaism is a less religious form of Judaism. And that's how a lot of people quantify it. And I think that's just incorrect, because I think a mature and an intellectually mature and evolved stance on what Reform Judaism is the idea of informed choice, which screams intentionality, right? The only way to be intentional is if we know, as opposed to a view where I think sadly, the number of times I hear on campus, oh, I'm Reform, I don't need to do that, when the thing we're talking about is the holiday of Sukkot. And I always think to myself, how are we in this sociological situation where somebody thinks that the entire holiday of Sukkot doesn't apply to them because of a denomination? So that was a very long-winded way. I hope that answers at least a little bit of what you were asking.
Sure.
I actually completely forgot what your first question was.
Oh, just if we practice Shabbat earnestly, will it spill over to the rest of the week, making it that much more difficult to differentiate?
So the short answer is hopefully. That's actually the entire subject of the last class here, and just a little glimpse of why our tradition is very explicit in its connection between Shabbat and the Messianic era. And at first glance, that seems crazy, right? And, I'm sure we have, in this group of, what do we have, 21 people here, I'm sure we have 21 different views on what one means when they say Messianic era. But our tradition equates Shabbat with what the world will hopefully look like when it's perfect. And explicitly, Jewish sources say the way to do that is to basically not give up hope, because it could seem like the other 6 days a week, and this is something that I think is very relevant to, a lot of times in history, but, especially now, we can look around the world and it seems like everything's broken, everything's terrible, right? This is, not my view, but one such view. Things are headed in the wrong direction. There's unlimited work to do. Why can't anything get done, right? And Shabbat is one day a week where we basically suspend belief. We enter into this communal pact where we say, okay, let's all pretend that everything is perfect for the next 25 hours. We're going to come together as a community. We're going to sing together. We're going to eat together. We're going to pray together. We're going to talk about Torah together. We're not going to worry about any of the other stuff, because then when Sunday hits again, right, Yom Rishon, right, the first day of the week on the Jewish calendar, we're back ready to say, okay, we've acknowledged what a better or perfect world can look like. Let's actually go back and continue working towards it. I want to get back to the sources only because there are a good amount of them, and I will unshare my screen and we can have some more conversation in a few minutes. But I wanted to use this as sort of an intro into talking about this question of environment. And I think that this will also become relevant to what a spectrum of Shabbat observance might look like. So we have, unsurprisingly, a spectrum of debate and discussion in the Jewish community of, does Shabbat pertain to the wider environment? Are we trying to cultivate an environment that's also a Shabbat environment, or does that just have to do with the individual? And there was a really interesting debate about this one verse on Shabbat in particular. So I'll just read it real quick and then we'll talk about it. So it says, Moses then gathered, convoked, spoke to the whole Israelite community and said to them, these are the things that God has commanded you. 6 days work may be done. On the seventh day, you shall have a Shabbat of complete rest, holy to God. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. We can discuss that another time. You shall kindle no fire throughout your settlements on the Shabbat day. So this is one of only a few times that the Torah gives concrete laws of what you should not be doing on Shabbat. Now, the reason why I highlighted this word kindle is because there's actually two ways to translate this biblical Hebrew verse. We could translate it, you shall not kindle any fire in your settlement on Shabbat day. The other way to translate it is, you shall not have, you shall not have kindled, any fire in your settlement on the Shabbat day. And this was actually a major dispute, right? One of the biggest disputes in Jewish history was between a group called the Karaites and the rabbis. And this is a fascinating Jewish historical debate, right? I think it's also, this is another side tangent, but I think hopefully an important one. A lot of times I think we have a recency bias in the Jewish community for thinking that divisions in the Jewish community now are at all-time highs. And we say, oh my God, how is the Jewish community so divided? And we sort of have this idyllic view of the past where everything was perfect. And all it takes is opening up a little bit of Jewish history to see in the year 2022, we're actually not doing so bad in terms of inter-Jewish division. Because in the 8th through 14th and 15th century, you had this massive division in the Jewish world between a group called the Karaites, who were biblical literalists, and the rabbis, who were the defenders of the Talmud, right? This vast oral tradition. And the Karaites read this literally. And so the Karaite position on Shabbat was that nothing that's forbidden to do on Shabbat, such as lighting candles, you could even have operating in your house once Shabbat hits. So the Karaites famously in the Middle Ages wouldn't have any lamps, wouldn't have any lights on Shabbat. And so they were, right, if we can imagine this position, they were on the most lowercase c conservative position when it came to controlling environmental factors on Shabbat, right? According to the Karaite read of what Shabbat meant, Shabbat means your entire environment around you has to be one of pure rest. And there's this interesting essay from this 14th century Egyptian Karaite rabbi who he writes, if you see me sitting in the dark on Shabbat night, do not think I am in distress, for God is my light in the darkness, right? So you can imagine this very hyper literal read of the Torah and hyper literal read of the laws of Shabbat that suggests that on Shabbat, the entire environment has to be controlled. Now, this understandably was not the rabbinic position. The rabbis also take up this debate. So I want to read this debate and then I would love to hear some thoughts on it. The rabbis debate this. This is what some of the earliest laws in the Mishnah of Shabbat, where the rabbis are very much taking up the same question. So we have a classic debate between the two schools of thought in the first century, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai says, and I'll read this and explain it, one may only place bundles of combed flax inside the oven on Shabbat Eve if there is sufficient time so they will be heated while it is still day. And one may only place wool into the dryer's kettle if there is sufficient time for the wool to absorb the dye while it is still day. But Beit Hillel permits doing so. Beit Shammai says one may spread traps for an animal and birds and fish only if there is sufficient time remaining in the day for them to be trapped while it is still day. And Beit Hillel permits them doing so even if there is not sufficient time remaining in the day. So this is a pragmatic debate, but this uncovers two different philosophies of Shabbat here. What Beit Shammai is arguing is that on Shabbat, we don't just care about you doing an action. We also care about an action continuing to happen. And so this would mean, if you imagine a world in which it takes an hour long to, let's say, turn on your heater system or turn on your air conditioner. So what Beit Shammai would say is you actually need to turn that on an hour before Shabbat, right? Because you can't start a motion before Shabbat that's going to lead into Shabbat. Just to spell out the ramifications of this, Beit Shammai ends up losing this debate in Jewish legal tradition. But just to spell out the ramifications of this would mean, and let me unshare my screen for a second. This would mean anything one does before Shabbat, whether it's set a phone alarm, whether it's set a timer for something to go on, whether any of this, that would not be okay. Because what Beit Shammai is trying to argue here, and just to lay out the philosophic positions here, and then I would love to hear some thoughts, and I see Susan already has her hand up. What Beit Shammai is saying is the entire environment on Shabbat needs to be a pure Shabbat environment. That it actually, action is only one of the things we care about on Shabbat, right? This is Shammai's position. We also care about what's going on in the background. So that means that we don't want to have any electricity buzzing in the background, right? Unless it was set up and substantiated before Shabbat. Whereas Hillel is saying that the environment on Shabbat actually seemingly matters a lot less. What matters more is the individual and their actions, as opposed to ensuring that the environment around us is perfect. Susan and then Ethan.
Well, I was thinking it sounds as if Shammai is saying that the process cannot continue into Shabbat. And it does go with actually what you just said. I put my hand up too early, but the idea of, because I immediately was thinking about a blech, the fire that you turn on before Shabbat, and then either put the tea kettle on to keep the water warm, or make chunt in the oven. That, in a sense, the process is continuing in Shabbat. And both of those things can be looked at as enhancing Shabbat, to have that warm cup of tea in the cold, to have the chunt in the cold. And so that's also, it's to me, Shammai is enforcing a denial of what could make Shabbat very pleasant.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that was actually summarized really nicely, whereas the rabbis are constantly looking for, I don't want to say loopholes, that seems like too strong a word, but the rabbis are constantly looking for ways to protect the laws on Shabbat on the one hand, but also ensure that Shabbat experience is nice, as opposed to the position of the Karaites. And this is actually the position for those who are Jewish history junkies. There's also, in the famous Dead Sea Scrolls that were found by the Dead Sea in 1948, the Dead Sea Scrolls were written by a break-off Jewish sect in the first century known as the Essenes. And they wrote a whole series of scrolls that basically gave us an endless wealth of information about what was going on in the late Second Temple period. And in one of the texts of the Essenes, they actually see the same thing, where on Shabbat, they would purposely not eat warm food, right? They would purposely not have any lights on and all of that stuff. Whereas the rabbis and the Essenes talk about, the evil people in Jerusalem, and those evil people in Jerusalem were, of course, the rabbis of the Talmud, that were devising basically a very creative way to ensure legal binding of Shabbat, which also making sure that it's enjoyable, which I think has actually been a very big Jewish ethos for the last 2,000 years, is ensuring we keep the tradition, but ensuring that the tradition is something that's actually promoting well-being on an individual or societal level. Ethan, go for it.
This may be an extremely literal response to Shammai's group, but wouldn't that also mean you couldn't light Shabbat candles to start Shabbat if you can't do something that'll carry in? Yeah.
So that would be the position of the Karaites. Whereas Shammai would say, if it took that long, let's say, for the candle to actually become lit, then you can't do it. So there's sort of three positions. The Karaites would say no. Shammai would say only if the light can be at full burning force by the time Shabbat starts, which of course it probably would because that takes 2 seconds. And Hillel would say, no, even a millisecond before Shabbat, you can light your candles. There actually is, one such, and this is, more of a scholarly analysis, the prominence of Shabbat candles, according to one read, might actually be connected to the fact that there were other Jewish groups that decided you're not supposed to have candles on Shabbat, which I think goes back to Susan's point, which was the rabbis basically affirming this idea of we're supposed to be comfortable on Shabbat, so much so that we're going to specifically do something that according to a literal interpretation of the Torah might seem wrong, to basically prove this point that Shabbat is supposed to be a time where it's a light, it's supposed to be a time where we have warmth, the food's supposed to be good, right? The rabbis were very worried, and Tammy, I'll take your comment in 1 second. The rabbis did not want Shabbat to turn into an ascetic practice, right? The rabbis really did not want Shabbat to be a time where everybody's sitting alone in the dark without food and just on the floor, suffering, because Shabbat is not about that. Shabbat is about, if we imagine the Maslow hierarchy of needs, right? In order to self-actualize, you actually need food and warmth and things like that. And so the rabbis were very careful to not have a version of Shabbat that feels like Yom Kippur, right? The rabbis, wanted to shove all of our ascetic, philosophic inklings into one day. They said, okay, here, take this one day where any ascetic, inspiration can be shoved into Yom Kippur. But the other Shabbatot of the year, and Yom Kippur is actually, sometimes called Shabbat HaGadol, right? But all the other Shabbatot, right, we are not ascetics. Tammy, go for it.
I changed my mind.
Okay, perfect. Or I hope the mind change at least was to something good.
I was just thinking about laundry when I was thinking about this, about somebody who does their laundry and puts it out to dry. And so then I was just thinking about that laundry drying during Shabbat, but I think you answered it a little bit in Ethan's question. I would just connect, I will say this though, but I'll connect the two things you said about Shabbat going into the week. I think somebody asked you a question about that. And so if you take the Hillel response, right, like it's supposed to be bringing light, all those things, then that would then connect with the other source about like Shabbat continuing into the week, because it will fill you up. It allows you to go into the rest of the week.
Yeah, I love it. Okay, so I am going to reshare my screen, and there's one more point that I want to explore just to sort of lay it out so we can understand sort of how this whole thing connects, right? Our really overall point is trying to figure out extra legal or environmental laws or philosophies about Shabbat. And so we discuss our sort of goings and the idea that our goings should be different on Shabbat. We discussed this sort of wider debate about how much we want to control the environment. The last part of Shabbat, which I think is actually in some ways the most important to a contemporary Shabbat practice, is the rabbis created a law that then actually becomes the center of a lot of legal Shabbat practice. And the law that the rabbis created is called muksa. Muksa loosely translates to something that's set apart. But the rabbis devised this idea where the rabbis didn't just want, and I'll summarize muksa and then we'll talk about some of the sources about it. The rabbis didn't just want Shabbat to be a day in which we didn't do certain things and a day in which we acted a little bit differently. I think this is what Henry said before, but if it wasn't Henry, I apologize. The rabbis wanted this to be a day where every single thing is fundamentally different. And so any object, and this is one extreme position of muksa, and we'll explore the whole gamut of positions in a second, one extreme position suggests that any normal object that you use during the week, on Shabbat, you should basically have a different one, right? A very extreme position, right? That's not what ends up becoming encoded in Jewish law. But I want to explore for 1 second these sources. Elaine, did you have a comment before we go to the source sheet? I see your hand.
I've always heard the word muksa in relationship to the toys that children are using on Shabbat. For example, if you have a toy that has lights or noise or produces some kind of a thing that you're not supposed to do on Shabbat, then a parent will say gently, that's muksa. We don't use it on Shabbat. That's always in the context that I've always heard it. I have not heard it in terms of adults using it as a means of saying, oh, that's muksa, you can't do it. Rather, to a small child, gently showing the child at a very young age that there are things that we do to separate the toys that you would use on Shabbat versus the toys that are acceptable.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. And I think colloquially it's used, especially in more traditional communities like that a lot more. In terms of the legal background, there's actually a very interesting philosophic debate in terms of where this category came from. There's a little bit of history also. I think it's sad also in the Orthodox community that muksa has just become like you don't want the kids to play with the thing that makes a lot of noise. But I think the actual laws of muksa and a little bit of the legal philosophy behind it, I think actually leads to a really interesting conception of Shabbat. Before that, we have to tell a nice story because all good Jewish laws start with a story. And so we're here in the end of the book of Nehemiah. For those who have not studied the book of Nehemiah, just a little bit of historic background here. The book of Nehemiah, aside from being one of the last books in the Tanakh/Hebrew Bible, is at a very interesting time in Jewish history, where if we recall, there was a first temple that was sitting in Jerusalem. It was built by Solomon. That temple was up for many hundreds of years. All of a sudden, the Babylonians come in the 6th century and destroy it and exile the vast majority of Jews to Babylonia. And then 70 years later, when the Persians take over and King Cyrus is now the king, he issues his famous Edict of Cyrus. If anybody here has ever been to the British Museum in London, you can actually see the Cyrus cylinder where Cyrus issued this famous decree. The Jews that were living in Babylonia were allowed to come back into the land of Israel. And the book of both Ezra and Nehemiah are dealing with the really interesting situation there, which was when the Jews got back from their 70 years living in Babylonia, none of them were overtly religiously Jewish. There had been a lot of assimilation, a lot of dereliction of Jewish practice. And so the entire book of Nehemiah, really the later part of the book of Nehemiah, is a speech that Ezra, who's the leader of the Jewish community, is giving these new Israel-centered Jews and basically giving them a pep talk of what you should do and what not to do. So it's from a historical perspective, it's a fascinating book. And here is what he observes. So he says, at this time, I saw men in Judah treading wine presses on Shabbat, and others bringing heaps of grain and loading them onto asses, also wine, grapes, figs, and all sorts of goods, and bringing them into Jerusalem on the Shabbat. I admonished them there and then for selling provisions. Tyrants who lived there brought fish and all sorts of wares and sold them on Shabbat to the Jews of Jerusalem. I censured the nobles of Judah, saying to them, what evil thing is this that you're doing, profaning the Shabbat day? This is just what your ancestors did. And for it, God brought all this misfortune onto the city. And now you give cause for further wrath against Israel by profaning the Shabbat. When shadows filled the gateways of Jerusalem at the approach of Shabbat, I gave orders that the doors be closed and ordered them not to be opened until after the Shabbat. I stationed some of my servants at the gate so that no goods should enter on the Shabbat. Once or twice, the merchants and the vendors of all sorts of wares spent the night outside of Jerusalem. But I warned them, saying, what do you mean by spending the night alongside the wall? If you do so again, I will lay hands upon you. From then on, they did not come on the Shabbat. I gave orders to the Leviim, the Levites, to purify themselves and come and guard the gates to preserve the sanctity of Shabbat. So he gives this very impassioned, very, some can say slightly extreme speech about how dare people be derelict in Shabbat. But then he goes on to institute a law that we were talking about before called muksa, where he decrees that any object, and this is the initial delineation of the law, and we'll talk for a minute about how this develops. We probably have like 15, 20 more minutes for those who are looking at their watch confused how we might end by 7 p.m. Where he institutes this law suggesting that any object that's not directly relevant for that Shabbat is off limits. And so the rabbis say, the sages taught, initially in the times of Ezra, they would say that only 3 utensils may be moved or used on Shabbat: a knife for cutting a cake of dried figs, a combined spoon and fork to clean the filth of a pot, and a small knife that is on the table. Each of these items is required for eating and may be used, and it had been prohibited to move any other utensils. So imagine this, the rabbis attempt to institute this decree where on Shabbat, no object, no item is able to be used except for those things that are very immediately relevant, right? So sure, if you want to have a bowl of cereal in the morning, you're allowed to use your cereal spoon, but if you're not planning on eating soup that Shabbat, you are not allowed to touch your soup spoons, right? Certainly you're not allowed to touch anything else if you're not directly using it for Shabbat. But this obviously became untenable. And so the Talmud continues. However, over the generations, when the rabbis saw that people were vigilant in observing the prohibitions of Shabbat, they permitted and they permitted, and then they permitted again. A fascinating Talmudic legal statement, until they said in the last Mishnah, everything may be used on Shabbat except for a large saw and the blade of a plow. And so what the rabbis are describing is this legal evolution of coming up with this category, saying you can't use anything on Shabbat unless it's directly relevant, to basically slowly rolling back that law until it's very specific things such as a saw and a plow, which, sort of like Elaine said, those are things that are directly, the only time you would ever use a large saw is probably to do things that are forbidden on Shabbat. I want to do 2 more sources, and we'll have a conversation. Would anybody like to read Maimonides here? What can I pick on? Who hasn't spoken yet today?
Here, I'll read.
Go for it.
It's okay?
Yep.
The sages forbade moving some things on Shabbat in the way that he does on weekdays. And for what reason did they promulgate this prohibition? They said, and just like the prophets who prohibited and commanded that you're going on Shabbat not be like you're going on weekdays, and that the speech of Shabbat not be like the speech of weekdays, as it is stated in Isaiah 58:13, and speak a word, all the more should the caring of Shabbat not be like the caring of weekdays. This would be so that it is not like a weekday in his eyes, and he comes to pick up and fix vessels from one corner to another, or from one house to another, or store rocks, and that which is similar to it. And he is surely idle and sits in his house and will seek something with which to occupy himself. And it will come out that he will not have rested, and it will nullify the reason for Shabbat, as it is stated. And in order that, you got to scroll a little bit, he will rest.
Perfect. You thought you were done. I apologize. A little more.
Okay. You just tricked me. And also, when one seeks to move vessels, the use of which is forbidden work, it is possible that he will occupy himself with them a little and then come to do forbidden work. That's pretty interesting. Moreover, since some of the people are not craftsmen, but rather idle all of their days, such as travelers and those that sit on street corners and rest from work on their days, it would be permissible to go and speak and carry like other days. It would come out that they would not resting on Shabbat that is recognizable. Hence, resting from these things, as opposed to resting from work, is resting that is the same with each person, with every person. And on account of these things they did, the prohibition of carrying and the prohibition of a person on Shabbat from carrying anything but vessels that they need will be explained.
Perfect. And he goes on to basically talk about which exact vessels are allowed and which aren't, right? If anybody's curious, they can go to the original source. So he's describing two fundamental reasons here for this category of Shabbat. And I'm curious, while I'm explaining this, I want to ask, is this relevant in our lives? And to what extent is this relevant and what not? So he's saying two things. One, he's saying, most pragmatically, you might just make a mistake, right? If you're carrying things that are only used for things that are not allowed on Shabbat, you might just forget. And so, right, some example of this is, trying to think of a good example, right? Matches, which are only used to, light fires, which are not supposed to be done on Shabbat. One very rudimentary example, I'm thinking of this on the fly, is you probably shouldn't use a box of matches to hold your place in a book that you're reading on Shabbat, because you might forget and you might end up lighting the candle because you want the smell of the candle. His second reason, though, I think is a lot more relevant. His second reason is saying, well, it seems like there's a problem with a communal or an environmental practice of Shabbat. The problem of an environmental or communal ethos of Shabbat is that work is different for everybody, right? This is what we explored last week. Me resting from work is not the same thing as the other 20 people here resting from work, nor is it different than, the 13 million Jews, right? Everybody's work looks differently. And so he says, well, if you want to feel like the wider community is engaged in this similar practice, right, it should probably be that there's, again, what I'm calling extra legal stipulations in place that say that on Shabbat, we're actually trying to create an environment that is the same for everybody. And so that means that all objects, basically, that are used for any type of work during the week or for any non-Shabbat activity, we basically recommend not to use. So let me unshare my screen here for a minute. The reason why I think this is so important, and the reason why I think this connects back to our intentionality discussion last week, is because, again, what this category is doing, unlike rigid laws that say you can use this, you can't use that, you have to do this, you can't do that, what this is, I think, implying, and the imperative that these sections of laws give us, is to constantly be thinking, whenever we use something on Shabbat, right? Last week we talked about actions. Now it's just in terms of physical objects. Whenever we're engaged with a physical material on Shabbat, the question is what we're doing with that item furthering Shabbat or not furthering Shabbat? And again, it doesn't make a difference from some perspective what the item is and what one might be doing. But is one using the world, right? Is one engaged in the physical world on Shabbat in a way that furthers that Shabbat, right? That's sort of the summary of what we're trying to cultivate here. So I want to take a few minutes for questions, and there's one more source that I want to do before we finish for today. Ethan, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, is that where the idea that your Kiddush cup has to be a special different cup than you use the rest of the week comes from?
It's a very good connection. Technically, it is not. Technically, that just has to do with the idea that we want the Kiddush cup to be a nicer, like a very special cup. But actually, we'll see in a second, one of the last sources that I wanted to do, there is a very extreme position of Muksa that would actually say yes. That would actually say on Shabbat, you shouldn't even be using the same utensils as during the week. But it is, I love the connection.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let me throw this question into the group. What relevance does this have on Shabbat for us? I accept anything from none at all to everything and everything in between. Go for it.
I think it's very difficult to take these concepts, these texts, and for people within the Reform movement, I'm not saying across the board, but for people that have not experienced what Shabbat is, with however you define that experience, whether you observe more or observe less. I think when reading this, it sounds very, I think it's very difficult to grasp the purpose of all of this, unless you have really experienced the beauty of Shabbat and understand what is the purpose of eliminating all of these things and trying to separate yourself from the mundane to something that's supposed to be holy, however that's defined. I'm not putting definitions on it. And I think it's like you're outside of the experience trying to understand what this is all about. What is it trying to tell you? In other words, what is the purpose of being a part of this experience if you haven't had the experience? And I think that's one of the challenges for Reform Judaism, is that we only go to the synagogue to provide whatever it is to experience Shabbat, versus within our homes to somehow experience what Shabbat is in the home. What?
Yes, I totally agree.
And I just think it's very difficult to connect with what we're doing without understanding, well, what's the purpose of all this? It's just a lot of discussion and debate. And, it's not part of my life. And why should I even be, what is it all about? That's my feeling.
Yeah, so off the top of my head, I think it's an important thing to explore for a minute. There's both the reason why the Talmud, and in this class, we spent almost no time talking about synagogue on Shabbat. It's almost, it's almost stunning to hear, but in the hundreds of pages of Talmud discussion on Shabbat, there's almost no discussion of synagogue Shabbat practice. The entire discussion revolves around the individual and the home to some extent. This is somewhat of an irony. The only time the Talmud really discusses Shabbat practice in the synagogue, there's a lengthy discussion on, if you've heard Kiddush and Shul, do you need to go home and make it again? And the rabbis decide, yes, you actually have to go make it again, because Kiddush and the Shul, well, that's just, that isn't the real essence of Shabbat. So yes, the question from, there's no magical recipe here. And by that, I mean, I'm imagining just a completely different metaphor here. I don't know how astute this metaphor will be. People can tell me if they like it or not. Imagine we're in a 6-week workout, class on, I don't know, how to end up doing pull-ups. And somebody's talking about a very specific workout. For people who are very much into fitness and things like that, it'll make sense how all these little things, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But it is very difficult to simply see how, bits and pieces here add up into a Shabbat practice. But I don't really see there being any other way. Meaning, I think the only reason why, just like working out, every individual action somebody does when they're getting into shape seems crazy. Like, what do you mean you're lying on the floor and then using your arms to push you up and then counting to 10? And one can say that for every point. And the laws of Shabbat are sort of similar. And so this is very much something where the whole adds up to something greater than the sum of its parts. And I actually don't know if it's possible to, obviously somebody can drop into a Shabbat meal or drop into a Shabbat experience for an hour or two and sort of see it a little bit. But I think the only real way is to come up and cultivate a bottom-up Shabbat practice through these concepts. And I don't see other way there than exploring the texts That said, with the irony that I basically have said every class, which is this is not a substitute, and this can't give us the full picture of Shabbat without actually having some practice, right? This is hopefully not theoretical. This is hopefully not, you know, a theoretical debate about different Jewish philosophies here about what it means to not touch objects. Hopefully this actually does inspire something. Susan, I see your.
Yeah, but I think that the analogy with muscle building is very good, because if when one starts to do workouts, one doesn't do 25 push-ups. One starts small. And that's also perhaps the way to learn and develop Shabbat practices, and which goes back to maybe a little bit what Meryl asked a long time ago, and because, okay, with the muscles, you start aching, but you feel the next time you do it, you can do a few more reps. Then, and with Shabbat, you can keep adding to slowly calm down the pace, to slowly begin to enjoy. That it, again, it's not an all or nothing, as you said.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, and it is one of those things where I think the ideological and also legal background are crucial for the building, but this is not the building, meaning this is, you know, the laws of Shabbat, and this is, you know, sort of how I see Jewish law in general, is the blueprint for how to build something. The actual building is going out and doing it. Which again, I think, you know, Judaism has a long, robust tradition of legal and philosophic scholarship, but that's not substitute for the real thing, which is actually going out and doing it, which is why Judaism's always had this sort of love-hate relationship with, you know, overly scholarship as opposed to being out in the world and actually doing things. And so yeah, I mean, it is a tough issue. And I think it really is a challenge for the liberal Jewish world here, for so many reasons. And I think that, you know, like a lot of movements, it's only going to be changed bottom up. Like, I don't see, there's no top-down solution in the liberal Jewish world. You know, we're for better and worse, mostly for better, we're a long way away from the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, where as the political and religious leader of the community, you can kick out the people that are selling things on Shabbat and then lock the city gates, right? Like, right, the metaphor of that type of practice, which that type of practice is actually still practiced in the mainstream, you know, Hasidic and ultra-Orthodox community, by the way, right? Like the way that the ultra-Orthodox community functions sociologically is a leader says something and basically it's unanimously accepted, right? Whether that be a good thing, a bad thing, right? A neutral thing, right? In the liberal community, I'm not just talking about the liberal American Jewish community, liberalism writ large is about individual autonomy and the reduced power of arguments from authority, which I'm all for, right? I'm a liberal both in a Jewish and a philosophic sense. And so this is only going to be changed by individuals internalizing these ideas. Otherwise, I'm afraid that Shabbat practice, it shouldn't be, I don't know how offensive what I'm about to say might be, whatever, I've never shied away before. Shabbat practice can't turn into the metaphor of going to church, which is, you know, there's 2 hours on a specific morning where it's blocked out and that's where you get your religious fix for the week. And then you go out in the world and you basically are, for lack of a better term, you know, an average American. And then, you know, next Sunday comes around and there's a real problem when that happens. One, because I think Judaism is quite literally meant to be practiced in the streets, right? It's not a tradition of faith over works. It's the tradition of works over faith to some extent. And also that ends up creating a hierarchy of religious leadership and religious power, right? Like there's an outsourcing of religion in the liberal world to the leadership, which I think is a huge problem. And I think that the only way around that is for everybody to basically have these fundamental concepts around, so that it's not just, okay, you have the rabbi of a liberal synagogue who's making decisions basically according to whatever he or she thinks is correct to do for the synagogue, and everybody else either agrees or disagrees, right? Like actually cultivating community where everybody is, versed to some extent in these concepts, and you can actually have an ideological conversation pitting all these different forces of Jewish tradition, of sociological needs to innovate, to what's happening politically, to what's happening socially. It really is sort of the challenge of, I think, our time in the liberal Jewish community. That said, I think studying a lot of these texts, at least the historical ones, gives me optimism because, 2,600 years ago, the leadership looked and basically nobody knew anything and was celebrating Shabbat. And actually, when you look, and I'll do this one source instead of the last source that I was going to do today, because I think this might actually be, an interesting way to end this, just to sort of highlight the idea that history is cyclical. So in this sort of same historic chapter with Ezra and Nehemiah, the Jewish community didn't know what Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot was, right? It's like they had gone to Babylonia for 70 years and had forgotten. And you get this really interesting, and again, for people interested in Jewish history, I highly recommend, reading this book of Nehemiah. So Ezra basically gathers everybody to the center of Jerusalem, and they start to read from the scroll of God. And this is on Rosh Hashanah. And Ezra turns to the people and says, "This day is holy to the Lord your God. Don't mourn or weep." For all the people were weeping as they were listening to the tradition. And so you have this scene where it's Rosh Hashanah. Ezra is going around and telling the Jewish community that doesn't know what Rosh Hashanah is, today is Rosh Hashanah, and the people are crying. And there's two interpretations as to why the people were crying. One interpretation is they thought Rosh Hashanah was a mournful day. Another interpretation is they were so ashamed that they had forgotten what Rosh Hashanah was. And Ezra's response to them was, go eat choice foods, drink sweet drinks, send food to people who had nothing prepared, for this day is holy to our God. Do not be sad, for your rejoicing in the Lord is the source of your strength. And I think this message really, really reverberates, because what he's basically saying, one, I think from a historical situation, right, there's ebbs and flows, right? This idea that, the liberal American Jewish community is the first generation in Jewish history to deal with sociological problems and adversity is just unfounded. But I think the message that Ezra gives, which is focusing on what we've forgotten and what we don't do, I think is the wrong answer. I think that the answer is the opposite, right? Like, let's go experience it, right? If you don't know what Rosh Hashanah is, if you've never experienced it before, go have a Rosh Hashanah feast, give a gift to your neighbor who might not have enough money for food, invite them over, and sort of experience the magic, kind of what you're saying, Elaine. So that's a long-winded way of saying you're right. And I think that this is sort of the way forward here.
I always like to think of the fact that we as modern Jews, actually all of the Jewish people, are Jews by choice, whether you're a convert or whether you're, born of Jewish parents. So that if we see ourselves as Jews by choice, then it's up to us to choose and to become knowledgeable and to understand. I'm always amazed at the converts to Judaism, because they really take Judaism seriously. I believe in many ways that our converts are the most, I don't like the word best, but they really take Judaism seriously because they've really chosen. And I would like to hope that we as modern Jews, born of Jewish parents, let's say, that we also choose, and we have that same excitement, and that we find within Judaism that spark that I find in our converts. So I think that we have to start from the bottom up. We have to.
Yeah, well, the process of rediscovery, I think, is really important. And if people have to go, by the way, I got a couple messages. You know, we're formally done, but again, I can talk about this stuff forever. And there's a problem where, and I think, you know, not converts, you know, specifically, but as a general category, converts are usually people who, at a later point in life, are coming to Jewish tradition with fresh and mature eyes, as opposed to people growing up in a Jewish community where everything's taught to little kids. And then at a certain point, it's decided that, okay, Jewish learning time is over. And now it's time to, you know, stop learning and, you know, show up to synagogue every week or do whatever, which is a problem. And then it's no wonder why a lot of these ideas are either we conceptualize them at a fourth grade level, or people have just never heard of them. And so I think that again, like approaching Jewish tradition with a fresh set of eyes, with a fresh analysis, without any of the biases we have of, you know, I heard from, I forgot if it was a student from someone 2 years ago. I was talking about the Talmud and why, you know, I just, you know, endlessly convinced that the Talmud is, you know, the most important Jewish work, you know, the most interesting, you know, just the thing to get people interested in Judaism because of these ideological debates. And they said, oh, the Talmud, isn't that Orthodox Jewish text? I was like, that's so sad. You know, this was a text that was codified 1400 years ago. The Talmud was sealed, and Jews have been studying it from Iran to Yemen to Russia to Germany to, you know, South America. You know, every Jew basically had the legacy of the Talmud. And so to decide that higher level engagement with Jewish learning is, oh, that's the, you know, that's what Orthodox people do is really a shame. I'm forgetting her name, but there was an Israeli MK, and she has a PhD in Talmud. And she basically gave a famous speech on the floor of the Knesset like 6-7 years ago about this also, about, you know, she was talking about secular Israelis, that how sad is it that secular Israelis don't know the legacy of the Talmud and things like that. And they basically decide, oh, the Talmud is, you know, for the Haredim. But I think it's similar also, you know, there's no reason why a deeper level of Jewish engagement should be something that's, oh, only other people do that. Okay, I'm going to formally just stop the recording. I'll keep the live stream on Facebook. I'm just stopping the recording, but I'm still here for any and all conversations.